Sahana vavatu, sahano bhunaktu, saha viryam karavavahai, tejasvinavaditam astu ma viddhishavahai. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Om. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May we work together with great energy. May our study be illumined and may we not unnecessarily cavil with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. So this is Spiritual Seekers question and answer. And as usual, I will mute my microphone so that you have a chance to formulate any questions. And we'll take it from there.
In the Bible, in one of the passages at the end, when the Holy Spirit is saying to St. Paul, go to pray, but not on the east. Do not go on the east. Go on the west. So they didn't send anybody to the east. And my question is, that's very interesting because maybe it's because the east, the people was already more in knowing more close to God than maybe the West and Israel people, or what's going on there?
I think we have to be careful not to take these passages updated into our modern 21st century and try to see what it means. So take St. Paul. What was the East to St. Paul? Now, let's take it for granted that St. Paul was kind of born in a kind of crossroads, cultural crossroads. And of course, he did his main missionary work in Antioch. Antioch was his great success from him and from him onwards. Now, Antioch is in modern Turkey. So, and was a Greek place, completely Greek. So even if he was there in Palestine, what is east? Well, we can say for them it was Syria or something like that. We have these distinguishing terms, Far East and all the rest of it. But I think we can safely say that in his era, East and West were quite limited. The far reaches of the West for Paul would have been Rome. And if we take the same distance the other way, eastwards, we don't get that far. So I don't think it's that, but we have to also bear in mind something Swami Purnananda said, that every main religion today is an Eastern religion. Was in the midst of deserts and women pulling water from wells and carrying it on their heads, and camels and palm trees and so on. This is an Eastern scene. And so Jesus was a thorough Easterner. I think probably Saul or Paul was maybe, and this is a little scholarly speculation from one of the scholars, was possibly the son of a Jewish person who entered into the Roman army, because that seemed to be the only way you're going to get Roman citizenship. And curiously enough, Paul has Roman citizenship. He also has a kind of broad-mindedness that Jesus' brothers do not have. And so the Jesus movement, if you want to call it that, centered in Jerusalem and Galilee, has his brother James in particular, who is probably his beloved disciple, sits as the head of the community following Jesus' crucifixion. And he sits there in Jerusalem. And that group of people who knew Jesus was so powerful that Paul has to, if he wants to make any radical changes or spread the Jesus movement in the West, he really has to go to the east. He has to go to James, and there he has to get some permission. So we know he talked at length with Peter. We know he talked at length with James. These are the leaders of the early community. We couldn't call them Christians at this point. So these were the leaders of a messianic movement that had their Messiah punished to death for claiming to be King of the Jews, which was tantamount, of course, to something like treason. Now, I'm just looking at it from a historical and scholarly perspective, not from a theological point of view. The theological point of view is something different. But it looks as if Paul was expecting an apocalyptic moment in the near future, as was Jesus, as was John the Baptizer, as with a number of the early followers of Jesus. And they were expecting the end of the world, the kingdom of heaven, to appear imminently.
And still now. Still
right?
now.
Yes.
Still now.
Yes, well, there are people who expect this, who expected it in 1800 something, Millerites. There were people who expected in the last century, and people who predicted in this century. And unfortunately, every time the date comes, it also goes, and they have to look for another excuse and another date. So I'm purely looking at it from the perspective of people who may have studied this, biblical historians, rather than theologians. Now, Paul's message is, Paul's message seems to be apocalyptic. And I think we find Paul's message, if we were to put it into a gospel, comes into Mark. And Mark is the earliest gospel. It's unfortunate that Christians will take Matthew first, or Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or take the synoptic gospels, as they're called, and try and make a synthesis of them. But they're all different. That's the problem. And two sources are being quoted. One source is Mark's gospel, and one source is what is called Quell, that is an unknown source, Q. And that is derived from comparing non-Markian passages in Luke and Matthew, and then seeing what they agree on, but it's not found in Mark, and they theorize that there's another source, maybe even the Gospel of Thomas, we don't know. You see, all of these are historical things, but Swami Vivekananda asked Sri Ramakrishna once, you see, what if Krishna never existed? What if Rama never existed? What if Jesus never existed? And Ramakrishna's answer was tantamount to something existed for it to be perpetuated for 2,000 years, 5,000 years, 7,000 years. And so something significant happened. And while Christianity today might not have had the exact resemblance of what Jesus taught, nevertheless, it evolved into a highly sophisticated religion, which incorporated Neoplatonism, that is, this concept of this word that becomes flesh and dwells amongst us, the whole idea of an incarnation, which is really an entirely Greek idea, Greco-Roman idea. It's not a Jewish idea at all. And so it was necessary to get this theological position. It was necessary to take this message into these Western countries, namely the Greco-Roman world, which doesn't insist on circumcision, in fact abhors it, doesn't insist on the Jewish regulations with regards to diet and so on, and yet is spreading a message that would have been recognized by those followers of Jesus who were sitting in Jerusalem, what later probably became Ebionites. So every religion, every mainstream religion that still exists today, more or less, seems to have its origin anyway from the East, be it Christianity, be it Jainism, be it Islam. It is all from the East, Middle East onwards, Middle East to the Far East. And don't forget, in the ancient days, the greatest highways would have been the seas. And so we know that a great deal of trade took place from China and India through the seas, never mind the Silk Route, through the seas to the Arabian Peninsula and to Sumeria and so on. And certainly 2,000 years ago, there would have been Buddhist missionaries in Alexandria and probably in Syria and so on. They were the earliest missionaries, really, who went out into the world, and they all went westwards. So maybe St. Paul is thinking, no point in tackling the East if you want to take it like that. We'll bring all this to the West. See, Swami Vivekananda's idea was the West has enormous value, and it is based on ancient Greece being the hub, the central fixation point for the whole of Western culture and civilization. And the Greek culture, of course, had some philosophy, of course, but when you see where they got the philosophy from, it might well have been because Alexander the Great had conquered much of Persia and some of India, and brought back some of these ideas. And so Socrates, for example, might well have gotten his ideas from there. Even if he didn't, there's a certain way of thinking which is deeper than a superficial kind of thinking that emphasizes only materialism, that emphasizes only science, physical culture, trade, commerce, and so on and so forth, which is common to every civilization, but emphasizes that. And so Swami Vivekananda sees that there are two great centers of civilizations, one dominating the East, one dominating the West, and the Eastern country will be India, and the Western country will be ancient Greece. And so that is why Greek was the common language amongst all the Christians. It was the sophistication language. Only later did Latin become the lingua franca. And that created division in the Christian church. It divided the Byzantine Christians and the Roman Christians. You might say the Eastern Christians and the Western Christians. So this division took place because of language difficulties, because of theological differences, and because of leadership differences, and maybe political differences also. So anyway, I think St. Paul's message is definitely designed for the Greco-Roman world. I don't think he would even have thought of spreading things eastward. But it seems that possibly St. John and probably St. Thomas may have gone more eastward. Tradition tells us that St. Thomas arrived on the Malabar coast of India and there established a Christian community there. Historical accuracy, we're not sure. If he went there, he might well have gone to northern India rather than the Malabar coast. I don't know. Anyway, it's not really important. The important thing in all these questions really is that there is a central underlying message. There's a central underlying theme in all of the religions who discover what Swami Vivekananda put out so succinctly, that each soul is potentially divine and the goal is to manifest this from within. And then he relegates doctrines and dogmas and temples and churches and books and so on and so forth as but secondary details. The great atheist Bertrand Russell was asked, why don't you believe in Christianity? Because I don't see any evidence for it, and I don't see any evidence for a Christian God. So either you believe it or you disbelieve it, and if you don't know what to believe, then you reserve your judgment. That's the idea. The underlying principle has to be really that each soul is potentially divine. Now, how do we derive that? How do we make an assertion like that? And how does every religion essentially make an assertion about that? Well, the Upanishads do it in a very systematic way. The Upanishads lead us back systematically until you have no option to say there's some internal life monad which is there, without which nothing else moves. And the argument supreme will be the three states of consciousness. Now, consciousness is a very hot topic today because of the rise of artificial intelligence. And only recently, only today, I saw that there was, through artificial intelligence, they have connected the spinal cord, for victims of spinal, spinal ineffectiveness, we might say it in a mild way. So the connection between the spine and the brain has been severed, and they're able artificially to connect that, and they're able then to use that to make the legs move. And a person who had his spine broken for the first time was able to walk, to mobilize his legs, because the neurotransmitters and the neurology of the brain being understood, there can be an artificial intelligence which is able to communicate with the brain and stimulate those brain centers and relay it artificially to the spine, and the legs move. And this is a major breakthrough. But of course, people of the philosophical bent are asking, well, wait, this is artificial intelligence. Is an artificial intelligence unit, such as a computer, is it conscious? Because who's to say what is conscious? Conscious meaning? Well, I don't know how you define conscious, because there are many definitions. Perhaps conscious means more than some organic entity that simply reacts. You see, no machine can be programmed to copy just about every function of the human being, except human moodiness, except human feelings and emotions. And I don't think any artificial intelligent mechanism can duplicate that kind of consciousness. You see, consciousness is just an assumption. Objective consciousness is just an assumption. I know what my own consciousness is. It's a non-physical thing. I know what I experience. I know that as I'm talking to you, I can hear a noise and my attention gets diverted, and that external noise comes into my awareness, my field of consciousness. And I know then that I can consciously react to that, make an independent decision about it. I can decide whether I like the noise or whether I don't. And I can decide what to do about it. And I can mobilize the legs and respond to it. Now, this is my personal experience, but I have no insight into your head. So your conscious experience, your qualia, your own subjective experience, I have no access to. I have no access to your dreams. I have no access to your experience. I have no access to your reactions. I have no access to your moods. I have no access to your cultural background, your memories, none of this. Now, the brain, of course, acts as an intermediary, is the idea. And we can see that through a logical regress, if you will, seeing that there must be an observer and a field of observation, and we progressively work backwards until we come across one entity, which is a supreme seer, a supreme knower and thinker. And it's a datum beyond which you cannot go, as they are fixed. So, and that must be consciousness itself, is how it's described, because you cannot get conscious experience from unconscious experience. So therefore your bottom line must be consciousness itself, a purely subjective thing, not a subject thing. Not subjective in the sense that it is my experience, my objective experience, and it is only mine, not in that sense. So this is a great area for research and debate, and it used to be the realm of religion, which says that mind and brain are something different. And still we hold that mind and brain are different. And so how do we explain it? Well, how to explain the fact that when there is a malfunction in the brain, or one section is isolated or stimulated, how is it that we get the corresponding experience? Let's take, for example, falling asleep or anesthesia. Even an operation where a certain segment of the brain is cut off, either through surgical operation or through chemicals, through drugs. Then we have various beta blockers and various things like this, Well, it's the same as the instrumentation of a light bulb. When the light filament is not working properly, well, then we get a new light bulb, or we correct the media, which is there, but there's a current behind it which is working through it. So this is a difference in perspective. And with artificial intelligence now being a highly, highly developed technology, we have to really address some of these issues. Not when I say we, I mean scientists have to address these issues more and more. The whole question of consciousness has to be there. From Descartes' point of view, there was matter and there was mind, and from Newton's point of view, there was a completely deterministic clockwork universe whereby everything revolves around causality. And then comes quantum physics and disrupts the whole thing and says, well, everything is indeterministic, it's probabilistic, it's not the language of reality. Now, long ago, of course, all the philosophers declared what we see as the world is unreal in the sense that it comes and goes, it's impermanent. And so there was something that was an inference of something permanent that is able to observe these things that change. And with each field of experience, you can see, it's a world of change, a world of multiplicity. There are comings and goings. It's subject to time. It's subject to space. And that becomes more and more subtle as you go more and more inward to find out what is the observer of that, and then what's the observer of that, and what's the observer of that, until you get, finally, where you cannot go beyond that. And the three states of consciousness really is the supreme argument for this, devised so many thousands and thousands of years ago. So how did we get onto that subject? We were talking about Paul, we were talking about his message, and we were talking about the central message that is enduring in any teaching. That's the message that endures. And I have no evidence for Christian doctrine, was what Bertrand Russell said. Yes, of course, if you think that doctrine is the complete basis and is the alpha and omega of every religion, then you'll be stuck and you'll be fighting with people of opposing theologies. The unifying factor will be that that all paths are true, all religions are true, on the basis that there must be a unity of existence, some totality that is discovered and discoverable by anybody and everybody who follows the same disciplinary paths. And all religions have exactly the same disciplinary paths. Scripture doesn't say what you should or shouldn't do for the benefit of God. No, it's doing it for the benefit of people who want to find out what is the way, what is the path, what should we do, what must I do to gain eternal life? Jesus gets asked this question, and his answer is very profound. He doesn't give an answer from himself. He says, what do the scriptures say? And the fundamental commandment, as it were, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength. And in the Bhagavad Gita, we have the same thing. Fix your mind on me. Exclusively, you see. So the message is exactly the same, and it takes a little work, a lot of work, actually, in the beginning. But even before the work, we have to have the enthusiasm for it. And as long as we are enthusiastic about the world around us, then we won't buy into it, as it were. So St. Paul's message really was to persuade the Greco-Jewish community in the West of a new message that would be acceptable to the Greco-Roman world as much as to the Jewish world, without sacrificing monotheism, to bring in some of the, or incorporate some of the secondary things in the Greco-Roman world, such as diet and all of these kinds of things, concessions being made. And Paul had to have that ratified. He had to go to Jerusalem, and he went with a whole bag of money. This is for you. And then he's describing his message, and he brings somebody from the Greco-Roman world with him and says, look, this is not an upstanding fellow, but he hasn't been circumcised and he hasn't followed all these rules and so on. But yet, you see, the Lord's message is still being enacted by people who are not strictly Jewish. So is that a good thing? I would think that's a good thing. So there can be a rule for those people. There can be a rule for all the original followers of Jesus who are definitely Jewish. Now, we see he has something of an argument there, but the interesting thing about St. Paul is he never met Jesus. Of course, all the apostles, classical apostles, they not only met Jesus, but they followed him. They followed him, they served him, they roamed with him, they understood his talks, they got intimate teachings from him, all of these things. But Paul got nothing of that. And then it was on this road to Damascus, he gets this enormous revelation, and he declares, that makes me as much an apostle as those people who met Jesus and who are declaring that they're apostles. He's even saying he's even more so. I encountered Jesus at the deepest level, he says. See, this is not literally what he's saying, but that's the purport of what he's saying. And then if you look at the earliest gospel, which is Mark's gospel uses Son of Man, uses language. He doesn't have any narrative, any birth narrative. And he keeps the identity of Jesus secret all along throughout his gospel until the very end. And some of those things Matthew doesn't like, so he modifies them. And Luke deals with it just by eliminating passages he doesn't like. See, somebody calls him Rabbi, oh, good Rabbi. And Jesus says, who says I'm good? I'm paraphrasing again. Only God is good. Why do you call me God? Good, you see. So that is completely eliminated in Luke's gospel, I think. He just leaves it out. It's an awkward passage. So the difficulty is in interpreting scripture is that we have this traditional progression, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but Matthew is derived from Mark and an unknown source, and Luke is derived from Mark and an unknown source. And even John uses some of that as well. John is the latest. The earliest Christian texts, of course, around about 50 of this current era, not so long after Jesus' death, is all St. Paul's work. It's his letters to the Romans and so on. And 14 letters are there, and I think most scholars would take 7 of these to be authentic. Others are written probably by other people in the same kind of style, I suppose, but not convincingly enough for scholars to say, St. Paul himself wrote these. Anyway, these are some thoughts on this East-West thing. And yes, coming back to your original question, any profound message will have to go to the West because the East has it in abundance. That's the bottom line on it, after all of that. It's culminating in John's Gospel, and then the early church fathers after that in Christianity that formulate, battle with the nature of Jesus and formulate a theology. It takes them more than 300 years to do this. And they eventually come to a conclusion at the Council of Nicaea. Or the Council of Nicaea, I think, is where they formulate eventually, okay, this is what things should be. Anyway, with all their councils and so on and so forth. And it was only because the Emperor Constantine had wanted some cohesion in his empire, and understanding the growth of Christianity there, he was anxious to do away with opposing sides on things, such as Arianism and Alexander and so on and so forth. They had different perspectives. How do you work out to satisfy everybody? How do you work out theologically the nature of an incarnation? How do you make sure that there's a human side, there's no doubt, and there's a divine side, there's no doubt, according to and there are people who say only human, there are people who say only divine, and there are people who say, well, both, but it works in this way. And eventually they have to come up with the idea that it is like a mixture of the two. It's fully, actually not a mixture, but it's fully, 100% human and 100% divine. And that forms a kind of Trinitarian concept. And they battled it out, there's no doubt. For 300 years, there were many different versions. Even amongst the Church Fathers, there was something like that. Church Fathers means Ignatius, Clement, and Polycarp, and so on. Well, I feel I've talked forever.
Swami?
Yes.
Could you say something about consciousness then? Because with Satchitananda, if you leave out Ananda for the moment, it's no. But
why would you leave out Ananda?
Well, just for the sake of talking, because because what I was wondering is, like, they are one thing. It's not like that, you get the impression from sciences that, it's predominantly really assuming materialism, because its source of input is perception. And perception, it's agreed, in order to have an experiment, you can't have experimentation without perception. And it's third personal, because the perceptions have to be, the experiment has to be repeatable, which means that it's done by many people. But us as individuals, our consciousness, we tend to naively anyway think that our consciousness is personal. Because we see ourselves as separate. I'm not saying this is right. I'm just talking about it's a sort of natural way to see things. But if I understand it, in Advaita, they're saying that consciousness is reflected. So it's not a personal thing. So that if it's like my consciousness is derived not from my personhood. Like science is assuming that being and consciousness are separate things. And then if you start off saying everything is matter, then you're left with the problem that you have to try and get back to consciousness, since the whole game has started, assumes consciousness, because knowledge assumes a knower and an object that's known. So you have to try and, in their case, they're going to have to try and change they're going to have to turn the subject into an object.
Yeah, so there's a lot in your question. So let us view it from a materialist point of view. So from a materialist point of view, and many people think scientific point of view, although that's not exactly accurate, but if you are trying to explain things from a reductionist point of view, and from a science point of view as well, then you make an unwarranted assumption. And the unwarranted assumption is that there's an actual universe, and modern science suggests it is not. Never mind about philosophy. Philosophy demonstrates it's not. But modern science itself demonstrates that it's not, and people don't take that into account. How is it demonstrated? Well, in 1905, with special relativity, Einstein brought in time as a fourth dimension, but brings in this idea: how do you know when something is moving? How do you, if everything is variable and relative, is there anything fixed? And the only way to find something fixed that everyone agrees with is the total time separation between two events, between here and there, and now and then. And we find there's an illusion. Something 8.5 million light years away comes to us as 8.5 years ago. And it comes as an equation, the total time separation between two events, in the equation represented as the square root of s, is equal to 3 dimensions of space. X, Y, Z, we summarize as x squared, that's space, minus t, minus time. And you're left with nothing. If the two are equal, that's nothing. It means that the only thing which is there is a conscious observer. That's all. So that's the first equation that tells us two things: that everything that comes within the realm of time and space, if it is in vacua is the same, without anything else interfering with it, actually goes to zero. This we can regard as an equation of Maya. And then the next thing would be that this famous, in that same paper, in the appendix, we find this E equals mc squared, let's say. C squared is only there to reconcile units. But in other words, energy is equivalent to matter, misunderstood by many as energy is transformed. It's a transformational equation, but it's not. It's an equivalence equation. That means the only thing that you have is energy, and it has to be potential energy. Potential energy. Now, the potential energy required to keep things moving, keep things going, to wind things in, is called gravity, is the same as what is necessary to keep things wound up. It's called electrical energy. And it amounts to the same thing. So effectively, you've done away with energy as well. You've neutralized it. The 500 atom bombs per pound is required each way. And then the whole thing is based on uncertainty. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, that we cannot know anything, and nothing can be smaller than the Planck constant. We don't have to know anything about that. But you cannot have, if you have an uncertainty about position, and then you have a certainty, that, in other words, a reduced uncertainty of its momentum, how fast it's going, and vice versa. And that is laid out as equivalent to Planck's constant over pi, and so on and so forth. It means, again, the whole thing is based on a house of cards, I think is a good expression. So the problem is, it is not seen like that, and you're quite right. We take our individuality for granted. Now, there's a reason why we take our individuality for granted, because how will you operate if it's not like that? And we have to learn to understand the totality of something. And that's a hard lesson. So how do we do it? Well, we know we do it through 4 potential methods. Love of God is probably the most popular and easiest way, and we've just mentioned, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, says Jesus. Fix your mind on me, says Krishna, same thing. So, but are we fixing our mind on something that is incompatible with Advaita, with non-dualism, which only postulates with a certain apology that what is there is existence itself, consciousness itself, and bliss itself, and you cannot leave out the bliss. And why would you say that there's bliss? Well, the Taittiriya Upanishad explains it better, because it actually says Satyam, Jnanam, Anantam. That means infinity, existence, knowledge, and infinity. Now, infinity, what does it mean? It is only when you have a finite neighbor with a finite argument that you have a finite disturbance in your mind. And you don't have bliss. And when there's only one unity, you have bliss. Not only that, but when you discover that, then you're transcending everything else, and you're maintaining that bliss. And there should be evidence for it, yes. We seek bliss. In other words, we are seeking happiness. And therefore, our nature must be like that. Our nature must be supreme happiness or bliss, a blissful state. And so, yes, not exactly accurately, you will say that the Absolute is Sat Chit Ananda, but why Chit? Why is there consciousness? And how is it reflected? Quite rightly, you say that according to Advaita, all of these other things are reflected, yes. And the most immediate reflection will be a thin layer, if you will, if you want to put it like that, that includes a certain sense of time and space and potentiality. We call this God, the personal God, and we don't rule it out. And so we have to view Advaita not as an isolated system, but a supplementary position. And in order to understand it fully, it looks as if we have to climb the ladder of dualism and qualified non-dualism. And it is correct to say that the highest reading of the Absolute human mind will be Ishvara or God. And so it's an all-inclusive formula. The problem, I think, today, and maybe in the past as well, in certain schools of philosophy, have taken Advaita in isolation and said, we have to get to that immediately, but practicality itself says it's impossible. And Shankaracharya, who's the proponent of it, of the 8th century onwards, and arguing with Buddhists on matter, and other philosophers on the matter. So Shankaracharya writes beautiful, beautiful, beautiful theistic devotional hymns. Okay, go on.
Yeah, no, but experientially, if somebody is going back or evolving backwards, is that really? I mean, the reason, is that really a movement towards silence? Or a move?
Well, you see, every question will have multiple answers based on from where you're standing. From a non-dualistic point of view, there's only and there's no evolution. If you take time away, there's no evolution. So it looks like something evolving. And I come back to my example of the frog scientists with the cone being introduced in the water, and they're dimensionally deficient, as we all are, and they only see something evolving into something, and because they're unable to see the totality. What do we do in spiritual life? We cultivate more and more the generalized view of totality, and we do it through these various methods, these yogas, and the more we do it, the more opens up, the more the totality opens up for us.
Are they really could they be looked on then as a process of losing your misidentifications with with particular things like your role, your because what is your ego but a set of identifications with various things or aversions from various things?
No. Your ego comes from the fact that there is a pure being, which is existence itself. You see, you cannot have something in the relative world that doesn't have its echo in the absolute. Otherwise, we cannot believe the absolute. If you say that everything, the becoming aspect, the relative aspect, is a reflection, then what you have to say is, then there must be evidence everywhere. The evidence for bliss is we desire happiness and joy, unending. The evidence for existence itself is we have an identity and we live with that. Now, where it becomes an obstacle is when we take the original ego, the original I, the sense of pure being, and identify it with the instrument of it, namely body-mind complex, a psychophysical unit.
But isn't that's what I was meaning by ego? Because
Yes.
because people like, for example, okay, you have your body or whatever, and you have your mind. You're brought up in a certain culture. Certain people,
Yes. But
so identify with their country.
Now I'm going to play a game with you. Whatever statement you make, add on in the waking state.
Yeah, I totally accept that. I mean, sure, all Western philosophy is just based on two of the three. It's really just there's no talk about deep sleep, and dreaming was only articulated maybe the time of Freud. From Freud onwards, it only got a bit of it, and that's not that Freud is not, it's not that long ago. So
Well,
it was always, if you look at it in terms of
except that in biblical times, of course, dreams were significant.
Yeah, no, certain cultures did have say something
in every culture. Yeah,
because that was a natural thing, but nobody said anything about deep sleep. There's no cultural articulation about that, or very little outside, and dreams were they didn't have a scientific status, for want of a better, whatever that means. It's only from
because you see, because all these studies are from the waking state.
Yeah, exactly.
And the assumption is that the only real state will be the waking state. The dream is not real. And the dreamless sleep is, well, just a blank. It's a dullness, and that's all there is. But you see, what we do in our philosophy is we take the dreamless sleep, the deep sleep, as the most profound area of potentiality, of creativity. And then we take the dream as a profound expression of this creativity. And we take the waking state as a crude condensation of it. We turn it around completely. So the reality now has become totally, reevaluated and is completely, turned inside out, as it were. And so it's worthwhile looking at that, because you see there's 3 states of consciousness, 4 if you take the observer, will tell you conclusively and logically that 3 states coming and going and observed, then the observer cannot be part and parcel of it. And yet, where do these states of consciousness come from? It must come from consciousness itself, which is the observing entity, the witness. So there's logic now. Logic is one thing, and it's impeccable logic, no doubt, because it ties up with our experience of it as well. But it doesn't, as long as we view ourselves as real individual entities in the waking state, and that's all there is, then we are liable to continue looking, and we are liable to continue suffering as well. And the reason why these Wednesday evenings are called question and answers for spiritual seekers, question and answer, is really because everyone is seeking the same thing, basically. We just happen to be in a group which says we'll find the answers in spirituality. What do we mean by spirituality? The acknowledgement of some sound principles based on philosophical understanding, logic, and experience, and the practice of it, which catches the emotions up and gives us a real understanding, real feeling, understanding of the reality. And that process is the working process. But we have to acknowledge, step by step, of course, for most people. There are gifted people with divine grace bestowed upon them who can go directly without going through the cosmic mind, as it were, who can go directly into the Godhead, as it were. I'm using Meister Eckhart's language now. There is a question in text. There is a chat. So it says, don't you think that there is a church of Jesus and a church of Paul? Paul was so different from Peter and the other apostles. Yes, I do. But of course, that's almost irrelevant because the current version of Christianity that we have today has evolved over time with profound experience and mysticism. And that has the doctrines have been woven into that. And so there are gifted saints and mystics who understand the reality that Paul experienced and the reality that Jesus experienced. And so, yes, I do believe that Jesus' followers were Jewish Ebionites, and they were following a messianic movement, expecting an apocalyptic messianic deliverance from Roman tyranny and so on, something like that. And such a powerful movement must have been there enough to disrupt the commerce of the temple in Jerusalem, and for Jesus to be arrested, and for the apostles to be scattered, and for such a severe punishment, which is clearly identified what it was. And St. Paul's in-depth revelation, which gives a more, mystical insight and a real insight how fired up he was on the basis of that, and some profound messages of deep spiritual value that St. Paul has. And it doesn't seem to be that he disagrees with the Jewish followers of Jesus who ascended in Jerusalem about the teachings. The disagreement comes in who has access to the teachings, and is it the kind of and also the interpretation of an afterlife experience and things like that. So I think there were probably different interpretations gotten perhaps from Greek culture and philosophy and thinking. So, but it's all speculations. Anyway, what we have as a Christian church is definitely Pauline, and I don't think Peter's church has much to do with it. Is my personal opinion. I can only give my personal opinion on this. But is it relevant? No, it's not relevant, because what we have today is a religion which has great depth. And Swami Vivekananda's comment on Roman Catholicism was, it is a religion in his day anyway, that has great depth, but not much breadth. Now today, the breadth is broadening, there's no doubt, inevitably, and my personal understanding is because of the advent of Sri Ramakrishna, that you get this breadth as well as this depth. Then there's another question. Another question is, a path within two religions like Christianity and Hinduism could be valid? Many people follow this kind of new religion. I don't see Christianity and Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism as separate things. I belong to the Dublin City Interfaith Forum, representing Hinduism, no doubt, but I'm the only religion which says all your religions are true. There's no religion which is false. And all of them are different paths. That is a very, very difficult step too far for most of the religions. I think Judaism might accept it to some extent, although they'd interpret Hinduism as polytheism and have a problem with that. Sikhism is one of the religions which is there, and Sikhism is fully on board because Guru Nanak took Hindu texts and Muslim texts and amalgamated the two, as it were. And then you have, but you have Christianity and Islam, who are definitely view themselves as exclusivist religions. And it is really only more enlightened beings, Christians and Muslims, such as Sufis, for example, and the mystic Christian saints, who would really see this underlying unity. And once you understand, there is no Christianity, there's no Hinduism, there's only this one thing called truth. That is why we teach Vedanta, because Vedanta is that ocean of truth. And its expression can be identified in so many different ways, as a religion or a non-religion. It doesn't really matter. The method with which you follow, preferably you should follow a religion which you're brought up with and discover the profound depths within that religion, and take Vivek and understatement very seriously, that each soul is potentially divine, and the goal is to manifest that from within. And we have a number of different ways of doing this, and they're all psychological ways, by the way. And one or more or all of these, and be free. And then to say the actual scaffolding of a religion in terms of its texts, in terms of its teachings and doctrines and dogmas and so on, are secondary details. The primary thing is this truth. Now, if Jesus taught it, he called it the good news about the internal kingdom of heaven. And if Paul taught it, it was in terms of the process, in terms of running the race, and in terms of getting this kingdom again, this unity of existence, this oneness, this eternal life, this immortality, and taking the body, just lining up with the previous question, taking the body as a temple of the divine, taking it as like a piece of clothing that you can take off. These are expressions and similes that he was using. So I don't see these, if we see these religions in a separate way and identify the real religion as a series of teachings and cultural standards and norms, we will miss the unifying factor so desperately required. So many people follow this kind of new religion. Well, I don't think that amalgamating Hinduism and Christianity in the secondary sense has much value. But if you create your own set of rituals and so on and understandings, you see everybody has an internal thrust, a movement, a push from inside to get to the highest conclusions of humanity that Dermot also happened to mention. We're all on the ladder to there. We're all naturally evolving towards that. As it were. I always have to say as it were, because from another perspective, the final conclusion of non-dualism, nothing is evolving. It's already full and free and perfect. Keeping that understanding in our back pocket, we now progress along the prescribed religious lines of moral teaching and ethics and profound, intense experiences in meditation, doing all actions as divine actions with great affirmations, wonderful affirmations. In Florence Scovel Shin's wonderful book, The Game of Life and How to Play It, she gives some wonderful affirmations, which assist, for example, getting up in the morning, You might say, what a glorious day. And thy will be done this day. Today is a day of completion. I give thanks to this perfect day. Miracle shall follow miracle, and wonder shall never cease. All with the idea that the Supreme is there within, urging us forward and moving us to higher and higher perspectives, unfolding us until we arrive at that point of understanding, realization, and freedom. So, making these kinds of movements as habits gives us this eternal freedom. And I know we've discussed a lot of philosophy this evening, but really the bottom line really is this wonderful experience of your own internal nature, bit by bit, that religion calls God, this eternal self. Tuning the attention into the glory of the self. This is called spirituality. It doesn't matter what religion you follow. You see, you can follow many religions and do it all on the surface and congratulate yourself as being a good person, a religious person, but without the depth that we're talking about, it really has no meaning. It is ineffective eventually, until there's a shift in your understanding and you decide that you will transcend these things. And Buddha is a good example of this. Buddha followed the standards and norms and all of the austerities, severe austerities, fasting himself almost to death, and then decided, this is not getting me anywhere. It's actually compounding the pain. Let me sit down, no map, no compass, and discover this truth inside, not outside. Now, did he found a religion as a result? Did Jesus found a religion? None of them founded a religion. Unless, of course, you declare Jesus was a thoroughgoing Lutheran. I've heard some people say that. Maybe it was me. Okay. All right. So I think we'll leave it there. All good.
Thank you, Swami.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Yes.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Thank you, Swamiji.
Peace, peace, peace be unto all. Good.
Thank you, Swamiji.